When Russia shows up in Africa, most people think they already understand the story. They picture soldiers landing at airports, arms deals signed behind closed doors, or foreign companies digging into the ground for gold and oil. That version of the story feels familiar, almost predictable. But it's also incomplete, because the most consequential move Russia is making in Africa today isn't happening in mines, and it isn't happening on battlefields. It's happening in places most people never look. Inside energy agreements, inside financing terms, inside technical cooperation documents that lock countries into decisions stretching half a century into the future. While the world debates visible conflicts, Russia is quietly inserting itself into the most sensitive nerve of modern power: electricity. Not emergency power, not temporary fixes, permanent power. Across Africa, governments are facing a reality they can no longer escape. Populations are growing, cities are expanding, industries are stalling, and electricity shortages are not an occasional problem. They are a permanent feature of daily life. Blackouts aren't news, they're routine. Factories shut down not because there's no demand, but because the power cuts out. Hospitals rely on generators as if they are part of the grid. Businesses plan around fuel shortages before they plan for growth. This is the context Russia understands better than anyone else. Africa doesn't have an ideology problem. It has a baseload problem. It needs electricity that works every hour of every day, regardless of rain, sunlight, fuel prices, or political instability. And nuclear power offers exactly that. One plant can supply steady electricity for decades. No waiting for wind, no praying for rainfall, no scrambling for diesel. But nuclear power is not just another energy option. It is a commitment that reshapes a country's future. Once nuclear enters a national grid, it doesn't leave easily. The technology, the fuel, the safety systems, the software, the training, the waste management, all of it is tied to a single supplier for generations. Nuclear energy doesn't just power cities, it locks relationships in place. And this is where Russia's strategy becomes clear. Through its state nuclear corporation, Russia isn't offering reactors alone. It's offering entire systems. Financing that covers costs. African governments can't afford upfront. Construction handled by Russian firms. Fuel supplied by Russian companies. Engineers trained in Russian institutions. Regulators shaped by Russian standards. Support contracts that last 40, 50, sometimes 60 years. This is not a transaction. It's an embedding. And while Western countries debate environmental approvals, political conditions and risk assessments, Russia moves forward. Agreements are signed. Students are sent for training. Planning frameworks are put in place. By the time criticism arrives, the foundations are already laid, legally, technically, and financially. In Egypt, this strategy has moved beyond paper. At El Dabar, a massive nuclear project is rising with Russian financing and Russian technology. The repayment schedule stretches decades into the future. This isn't assistance meant to end. It's dependence structured to endure. And Egypt is not a special case. It's a model. Across the continent, similar conversations are happening quietly. Not because African leaders are choosing Russia out of loyalty or ideology, but because they are choosing electricity over darkness, development over stagnation, stability over uncertainty. But here is the part almost no one says out loud. Nuclear power doesn't just solve problems, it redistributes leverage. Once your grid depends on one supplier, that supplier matters, politically, economically, and strategically. Elections change, governments fall, alliances shift, but reactors remain, and so does the influence behind them. So this story isn't really about energy, it's about time, it's about who positions themselves to matter 20, 30, 50 years from now. And while others hesitate, Russia is betting that whoever controls the power infrastructure controls far more than the lights. This is only the beginning. To understand why this strategy works so well, you have to understand how deep Africa's electricity crisis really runs. Power shortages on the continent are not temporary setbacks. They are structural. They shape daily life, economic outcomes, and political legitimacy. In many countries, electricity is not something citizens expect to have continuously. It's something they hope for. Entire industrial plans collapse because machines can't run uninterrupted. Investors walk away, not because labor is unskilled or markets are small, but because power is unreliable. Governments announce development visions, but those visions quietly depend on generators humming in the background, burning fuel that has to be imported, subsidized, and protected. Renewables are often presented as the solution, and they do matter, but solar and wind alone cannot carry an industrial economy. They fluctuate. Storage is expensive. Hydropower depends on rainfall patterns that climate change is making less predictable every year. Gas depends on pipelines and security and political stability, things many regions struggle to guarantee. African policymakers know this. Behind closed doors, the conversation is brutally practical. They are not asking for perfect solutions. They are asking for power that does not fail, power that runs at night, power that doesn't shut down factories mid-shift, power that can anchor steel plants, rail networks, data centers, and manufacturing zones for decades. This is where nuclear power becomes seductive. Nuclear energy offers something rare in Africa's energy landscape: predictability. Once operational, a nuclear plant delivers massive amounts of electricity, continuously for 40 to 60 years. No weather dependence, no fuel trucks, no seasonal planning, just steady output. For countries trying to leap from low income to industrial economies, that promise carries enormous weight. Western countries understand nuclear power's value, but their approach to Africa has been cautious to the point of paralysis. Financing is fragmented, environmental and political conditions pile up, approval processes stretch endlessly. In some cases, African leaders walk away, feeling not advised but dismissed. Russia approaches the same problem differently. Instead of separating financing, construction, fuel supply and training into complex negotiations, Russia bundles everything into a single offer. One agreement covers the reactor, another covers fuel, another covers training. Loans are state-backed. Repayment is delayed. Support is long-term. The message is simple. We will stay with this project for as long as it exists. That matters, because nuclear power is not just about infrastructure, it's about institutions. You cannot operate a nuclear plant without trained engineers, regulators, safety agencies, emergency protocols, and legal frameworks. Russia doesn't just build reactors, it helps design the institutions around them. African students are trained in Russian universities, regulators learn Russian systems, technical standards align quietly over time. This creates a form of influence that doesn't announce itself. There are no flags, no bases, no press conferences. But years later, when decisions are being made about upgrades, fuel cycles, or expansion, the ecosystem already speaks Russian. And unlike military agreements, nuclear cooperation can't simply be cancelled when politics shift. A weapons deal can be frozen, a troop deployment can be reversed, but a nuclear plant must run. Loans must be repaid, fuel must be supplied, maintenance must continue. Even if relations cool, the infrastructure remains. This is why Russia's nuclear strategy is not fast, it's patient. It doesn't aim for headlines, it aims for permanence. Countries like Egypt, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Ghana, Rwanda and others are not lining up because they suddenly trust Moscow more than anyone else. They are lining up because electricity is existential. Without it, development stalls. With it, governments gain breathing room, legitimacy, and leverage. But every solution carries a cost. Nuclear power concentrates risk as much as it concentrates energy. Debt accumulates quietly, technical dependence deepens slowly, and the longer a country stays inside one nuclear ecosystem, the harder it becomes to exit without disruption. This is the trade-off Africa is now facing. Not whether nuclear power works, it does, but whether the terms under which it is adopted preserve long-term autonomy or traded away piece by piece. And to see how this plays out in practice, we need to look at the specific countries where Russia's nuclear footprint is already taking shape. When you start mapping Russia's nuclear agreements across Africa, a pattern emerges that's easy to miss if you look at each deal in isolation. These are not random partnerships. They are carefully spaced, strategically placed, and designed to create a long-term presence that survives political change. Russia isn't betting on one government, it's betting on infrastructure. Egypt is the most advanced case, but it's not the most revealing. What makes the strategy clearer is how Russia adapts its approach depending on the country. In some places it pushes full-scale reactors. In others, it starts smaller, training programs, feasibility studies, regulatory assistance. The goal isn't speed, the goal is positioning. In Ethiopia, for example, the agreement with Russia goes far beyond a single power plant. It includes institutional development, technical planning, and long-term capacity building. Before concrete is poured, systems are aligned. Before electricity flows, expertise is shaped. This is how dependence is created quietly, not by force, but by familiarity. Then there is Niger, where the strategy shifts again. Niger isn't just a potential customer, it's a supplier. One of the world's key uranium producers Niger sits at the very beginning of the nuclear value chain. By deepening cooperation there, Russia isn't only expanding influence downstream in power generation, it's securing leverage upstream in fuel supply. That turns cooperation into integration. Across the continent, more than a dozen African states have signed nuclear cooperation agreements with Russia in some form. Some are ambitious, some are preliminary. Some may never lead to reactors. But every agreement adds another thread to a growing web of technical standards, training pipelines, regulatory frameworks, and long-term expectations. This is what makes nuclear power uniquely geopolitical. Unlike roads or ports, nuclear scene infrastructure shapes how states think. It forces governments to plan decades ahead. It ties budgets to long-term repayment schedules. It anchors national development strategies to one technological ecosystem. And once those decisions are made, reversing them is politically and economically painful. Russia understands this. That's why it doesn't rush to finish projects if conditions aren't perfect. Time works in its favour. While Western partners hesitate or withdraw, Russian agreements remain on the table, waiting. For countries under pressure to deliver results, waiting options eventually become chosen options. But there is another layer to this strategy that rarely gets discussed. Nuclear cooperation also reshapes how countries relate to the global system. Nuclear energy requires compliance with international standards, safety regimes, and oversight bodies. Whoever helps you navigate those systems becomes a gatekeeper, training regulators, writing safety protocols, and setting. Operational standards may sound technical, but they quietly shape sovereignty. If your regulators are trained in one system, your policies tend to follow that system. If your engineers are educated in one ecosystem, alternatives feel risky. Over time, choice narrows, not by force but by institutional inertia. This is why nuclear influence is so durable. Even if diplomatic relations cool, the reactors don't stop. The fuel must still arrive. The systems must still be maintained. The debt must still be serviced. Political disagreements don't shut down power plants. They just make dependence more uncomfortable. From Moscow's perspective, this is stability. From Africa's perspective, it's a gamble. On one hand, nuclear power offers a real chance to break the cycle of energy poverty. It can support industrialization, reduce reliance on fossil fuels, and stabilize national grids. On the other hand, it concentrates power, technical, financial, and political, in ways that are difficult to unwind. This is why Western governments are watching Russia's nuclear push with growing concern. It's not about losing contracts. It's about losing long-term relevance. Whoever anchors Africa's energy systems will have a seat at the table for generations. And right now, Russia is claiming that seat quietly, one agreement at a time. The question for Africa is not whether nuclear power is useful. It is. The question is whether these partnerships are being negotiated from a position of long-term strength or short-term urgency. Because infrastructure decisions made under pressure often look very different decades later. And that brings us to the final issue, the one that will ultimately determine whether this strategy benefits Africa or binds it. At the centre of this entire story is a choice that Africa can't afford to make casually. Nuclear power itself is not the threat. Many countries use it safely and successfully. The danger lies in how it is adopted, how it is negotiated, and how much control is retained once the deal is signed. Because nuclear energy is not just infrastructure. It is a system that never truly ends. Fuel cycles stretch across decades. Waste storage lasts centuries. Safety responsibilities never disappear. And the political relationship behind the reactor often outlives the government that approved it. That's what makes these decisions so heavy. Russia understands this reality clearly. That is why it offers convenience. One partner, one package. Financing, construction, fuel, training, maintenance, and technical management all bundled together. For governments under pressure to deliver electricity quickly, this feels like relief. Progress without friction, development without delay. But convenience always has a price. When fuel comes from one country, when spare parts come from one supplier, when engineers are trained in one system, and when debt repayment is tied to long-term output, independence becomes complicated. Even if political relationships shift, walking away becomes expensive, disruptive, and risky. The lights must stay on. The reactors must keep running. This is the quiet tension at the heart of Africa's nuclear moment. On one side is real opportunity. Nuclear power can anchor industrial growth, support modern infrastructure, stabilise grids, and reduce reliance on fossil fuels. It can power railways, factories, data centres, and cities at a scale few alternatives can match. For a continent racing against population growth and urban expansion, that matters. On the other side is structural dependence. If contracts are opaque, costs can quietly rise. If institutions are weak, oversight suffers. If local expertise isn't built aggressively, countries remain permanently reliant on foreign operators. Energy independence can slowly turn into energy capture, not through force, but through systems that are too complex to exit. This is why the real question isn't whether Africa should use nuclear power, it's whether Africa controls the terms. If African states treat nuclear energy as a bridge, investing heavily in local training, diversifying partners, strengthening regulators, and maintaining leverage, nuclear power can support genuine sovereignty. But if nuclear deals are rushed for political wins or signed under pressure without long-term planning, the consequences will echo for generations. Russia didn't come to Africa with only soldiers because soldiers leave. Reactors don't. They shape budgets, policies, alliances, and leverage long after headlines fade. In a world where oil and gas are slowly losing dominance, controlling energy infrastructure is a way to remain relevant without firing a shot. That's the strategy. And Africa now stands at a quiet crossroads, not between East and West, not between ideology and alignment, but between short-term relief and long-term control, between power that empowers and power that binds. Because in the decades ahead, electricity will decide far more than who has light. It will decide who negotiates from strength, who resists pressure, and who shapes their own future. Africa's biggest battles are no longer fought on battlefields. They are fought in contracts, power plants, and decisions most people never see until the consequences arrive. And by then the switch is already locked in place.